Welcome to the Department of Biblical Studies here in Sheffield at the University of Sheffield, and we're joined today by Professor James Crossley, who's here to talk about his latest publication. James, why did you decide to write this particular book?
Well, it was to develop some of the ideas that that were raised in the previous book, Jesus in Age of Terror, which dealt with big issues to do with stereotyping of Muslims, Jews, and Arabs, and in relation to the war on terror. But this time I wanted to look at the economic ideology underpinning a lot of the ways in which people think today. And in some ways, I guess the economic crash of 2008 must have, on some level, pushed my thinking at this point to write something on areas relating to neoliberalism, multiculturalism, and so on.
The economic counterpart of postmodernism and postmodernity you describe as neoliberalism, and you now say that this is a global economic phenomenon, including even China. How would you describe it to someone who said, well, tell me a bit more about it? What does it actually mean?
I think there's a number of reasons why this has happened. There was the breakdown of the previous consensus, the pre-1970s post-war consensus of much more state involvement in economics, and again the cultural handmaiden, if you like, would have been sort of high modernity. And then a number of things came through: challenges to authority in the 60s, the breakdown of the economic system by the early 70s, which led to a much more fragmented and individualised view of economics, culture, thinking, and so on. So I think it was a combination of the kind of economic problems and challenges to authority which were emerging at the same time, which brought about this kind of quite significant cultural change since the early 1970s onwards.
James, you say that many of the arguments about the perpetuation of neoliberalism, the self-perpetuation of it, aren't necessarily inevitable. But then you go on to say that really there's going to be no change. So in a way, are you not contradicting yourself on that question?
I think I would see it more as an unravelling of the present. There is a degree of inevitability in the sense that the scholars are conditioned by cultural context. I'm conditioned by my cultural context in this. I mean, I'm clearly working and reacting to big questions of the present to do with terror, stereotyping of key groups, and the economic crisis, of course. But it's to look back and see and explain how we got to this point. But as I said in the concluding chapter, there's the future is anything but certain on this. Neoliberalism may regroup in the aftermath of 2008, but it's not clear that this is necessarily going to happen. We've seen all sorts of reactions globally and locally to this, and in 10, 15, 20 years' time, things might look quite a lot different. We could be asking different questions, engaging with different issues as a result of these kinds of changes.
Okay, that's fine, but why do the effects of neoliberalism bother you so much? It's quite clear in the book that you are quite bothered by it.
Well, I mean, this book and the previous book have felt quite personal in this sense. I see people perpetuating kind of ideological positions without knowing, and some of them are quite problematic. I mean, the ways in which scholars triumphantly talk about Judaism as if they're talking about it positively, when there's consistently this supersessionism all the time, even if it's done in a very nice, friendly way. But I think it still perpetuates some of the old anti-Jewish stereotypes and things like this. So those kinds of issues there definitely was. Some of it I get quite annoyed the way scholars talk about we all have presuppositions or whatever, and then just continue to behave as per normal and don't see that much bigger issues are at stake, not just how you as an individual were brought up and had your own kind of theological views. There are much bigger issues here, and which are having a big impact globally, culturally, on whatever. I mean, people's lives are at risk on some of these issues that that are discussed. So it's.
If we move on now to how this neoliberalism, as you describe it, has affected the portrayal of Jesus in the modern world, let's just take this notion that American foreign policy, for instance, has had a big impact on how we perceive the modern Jesus. How do you argue that in the book?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of ways in this. I mean, one is the kind of general social world of Jesus. How do we locate Jesus? And one of the problems, I think, is this construction of the idea of Jesus as a Mediterranean. Now, I mean, in one sense, of course, he was part of ancient Mediterranean culture, a part of, you know, broad cultural trends in the ancient world. But sometimes you find that this is sort of morphs into stereotypes about the Arab world and things like that. And I mean, and some very crude stereotypes about how Arabs are meant to behave, and which turned up quite regularly in things like the War on Terror, in the rhetoric about the clash of civilizations and things like that. The other issue that I thought is really quite significant is this idea of how we understand the Jew and Judaism, and this rhetoric of scholars relentlessly telling us how Jewish Jesus was, but always giving a get-out clause to show that Jesus was that bit better or a lot better or whatever in comparison to the Judaism they have constructed. So I think there's some really quite deep problems with the way people are doing this at the moment, the ways Jesus is used as this kind of figure. And you know, you see this, these cultural wars are really being fought.
And that's fine about America, but what about the Middle East?
Yeah, I mean, what we're thinking here is American constructions of the Middle East is the important thing. That factors in. The other thing is, though, of course, American constructions or British constructions or Western constructions of individualism in relation to neoliberalism. This is also really quite strong. Ironically, at the same time, we're both being told this is a collective culture, but we also have so much scholarship telling us how individual Jesus, how significantly different he was, how he acted like almost like his modern individual who could change history, do this, do that. We were always focusing on the individual details at the same time. And there's this, I mean, in many ways, these are two strands. One is this sort of big stereotyping. On the other hand, we've got this very individualising strand. And in many ways, it's a conversation that's happening in American and British culture.
You talk in the book about contradictions between cultural trends and the kind of theological portrayal of Jesus, how Jesus is perceived in the book. There are many of them. Let's just look first at the Jewishness of Jesus. What do you say in the book about that?
Well, again, I mean, this is where, I mean, the contradiction I would see this is between the personal beliefs of a given scholar and what is actually broadly produced. So I think individual scholars probably are very positive about Judaism, but the Jewish Jesus they produce is one who is constructed as relentlessly Jewish, yet at the same time better or different from Judaism in some way, whether this is a minor point or on a big issue on all the key areas of Judaism as constructed by scholarship.
And what about the nostalgic vision of the Pope and what you describe as his Jesus? Is that a little bit tongue-in-cheek?
Well, yes. I mean, Ratzinger's got this tension between wanting to embrace historical criticism, but not actually use it in the sense that, I mean, he comes out with a completely orthodox Catholic vision of Christ, and you find this again you find a very sympathetic audience. In the UK, particularly with John Milbank, the Radical Orthodoxy movement, and a book that came out from that group of people on the Pope and Jesus, which was a very, very favourable view of the Pope's reading of Jesus. And I think, again, there's a contradiction there because whether it's the Pope, whether it's Milbank, whether it's Radical Orthodoxy, there is this critique of neoliberalism, very profound critique. Yet at the same time, you find that their view of Jesus is both a kind of reaction, it's like the conservative reaction in the States, but also it buys into this idea of this great figure who changes everything, and so on.
And what about these biblioblogs? What are they saying?
The idea of biblioblogs is interesting because there is a much more degree of freedom there. There isn't automatically the same kind of pressures, corporate pressures and so on. But what I think with the biblioblogs is that there's a buying into dominant discourses without thinking. Now again, these people are perfectly good people. There's nothing. I'm not saying these are individually nasty people or anything like that. But when you take an issue such as the disaster in Haiti, how relentlessly across the biblioblogs, the same pattern you find in the mass media to do with trying to explain why this disaster happened is replicated almost exactly on the biblioblogs. And again, there's only the odd exceptions, just like there are the odd exceptions in the mass media.
Finally, James, the Church has a choice when it comes to this tide, this sea of neoliberalism. It either confronts it or it connives with it. Where do you think the Church is positioned at this time?
Yeah, that's a very tricky question. I mean, in many ways, the Church faces the same problem that scholars face. How do you negotiate your cultural context? Can you escape from it? in one sense, the churches do have an advantage because if you take something like liberation theology, which has managed to stand outside and be a genuine critical threat to a dominant neoliberal orthodoxy, and people have paid the price for this. We see something of the tension with, of course, with what happened at St. Paul's and the Occupy movement. I mean, it really split. You could see the split there in the church. Do we go the establishment route? Do we, engage with the bankers, or do we side with the Occupy movement? And it caused a genuine crisis, I think, in the church. I think there is a bit more openness, ironically enough, with the church to be able to deal with these issues, and you could, even if it does manifest itself in the ways it did at St. Paul's. With scholars, Jacques de Lineblau once said that scholars are like Marxist peasants, unable or unwilling to do anything about it. And and I think there is something of that. Sometimes when you see this in scholarship, you just see the mass of scholars will continue the way they're going. Because I think a lot of this critical stuff just bypasses some of the mainstream, really, and it gets shelved to a sort of critical edge where, sadly, I don't think it has the impact it perhaps should.